It is a pleasure to welcome you to episode number 11 of our series about the elections in Colombia, a series which indeed we began a year ago with Humberto de la Calle. All of the episodes are on a web page and YouTube channel. Now, today's topic Colombia, economic realities and political options, because we're 2 weeks from changing government, and the conversation is focused on the condition of the Colombian economy and the economic politic decisions for the new government. And to talk about this, it's a pleasure to welcome our panelists. First, let's welcome Jose Ignacio Lopez, Executive Director of ANIF and former Director of Economic Research of Corficolombiana. Welcome, Jose Ignacio. We also have Carolita Soto Losada, ex-co-director of the Central Bank of Colombia and ex-vice minister of Treasury and Public Credit of Colombia. And we have the pleasure of having Jose Antonio Ocampo again, Vice Minister of Treasury and Public Credit of Colombia and professor today of the University of Columbia in New York. Welcome, Dr. Jose Antonio. Thank you. Today's conversation will be co-moderated by Gedan, a senior fellow and director for a Latin American program of Stimson Center, and Ken Frankel, CEO of the Canadian Council for the Americas. Ben and the Stimson Center, thank you for your cooperation in this series. And now, let's give the floor to Ken. Thank you, Martha, and welcome everyone. And thank you to the panelists for being with us today. I believe that we should begin where do we stand today, right now, before we start looking at the efficiencies in current crisis. Let's ask, in these 4 years, were any developments made in fiscal, the institutional, the labor, the production, and inequality? And to begin with this, talking about the fiscal, it's a pleasure to give the floor to Jose Antonio. Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to be with you again in this forum. When it comes to the fiscal situation, you can say that early on in the government, and when I was the Treasury Minister, two major adjustments were made. The beginning of the reduction of the deficit of the Fuel Stabilization Fund, which had an enormous deficit of 2.5% of the GDP. It began with the gasoline when I was in the government, and fuel oil later. But as of June 2023, this didn't take place, or it was only partially made. And the other thing that was made, another tax reform in 2022, which adds to one that took place in the prior government in 2021. So I would say the both adjustment had an effect that was positive on public finances in the country in 2023. However, as of that date, there's been significant impairment in public finances. And I'd say that we're looking at one of the worst fiscal problems of the country. We have a deficit, which the ceiling committee estimates at 7% of the GDP. Indeed, in the comparative statistics of CEPAL, it's the worst fiscal deficit in Latin America. And we have a public debt now that's reaching more than 61% of the GDP, which is even higher than what was reached during COVID. So we see something very high. In Latin America, it's an intermediate level. There are countries with less debts like Chile and Peru, but others with more public debts like the case of Brazil and Argentina or Venezuela. So the basic reason of this impairment is the increase of the expenses in operation. That you can say that it has increased more than 4 points of the GDP compared to the decade before the COVID, the 2010. And also, the public investment has impaired significantly to a level quite low. And undoubtedly, that's one of the factors that has an incidence on this. Ahead, we can talk about the increased public jobs, which is considerable, and other topics. But undoubtedly, since 2024, we've seen an impairment, a fiscal impairment that's significant. Thank you, Jose Antonio. Before talking about deficiencies, Jose Ignacio, were there advances made? Fiscally, I think that there were advances made, but it's hard to be optimistic, as Jose Antonio said, at this moment. Why? Because in addition to structural deficit, in past years, we made decisions in the government and country that have made the structural problem worse. For instance, in 2024-25, there were laws enacted that imply permanent expenses above 1 point above the GDP. And that makes the fiscal problem even worse because we're talking about rigid budgets. For instance, a discussion very, very much held in the country, which was the legislative act abetting more decentralization, which we believe is convenient for Colombia. But in the ways it's hard to do so because if it's not well done, maybe a law made that is not formalized yet, we will have even more rigid budget rigidness. So today, Colombia is facing a problem of structural deficits with a small maneuvering margin, with figures of more expenses in operation. Jose Antonio already mentioned this, but I'd like to emphasize that we've had an incredible increase in the state-owned payrolls, and we don't see much multipliers in terms of growth. And that worries, of course, because in a, in you want to always go through good investments, but there are several items that this government has fragmented into small projects or with low executions. And of course, it doesn't have major growth to be shown. So right now, the situation is complicated. We've had a good mitigator, of course, and it's the appreciation of the Colombian pesos, which increases the metrics, of course. Just last year, this reduced the net debt by 3 percentage points. So maybe the debt, when the government leaves, is shown good in comparison. But again, mostly it's backed because of the appreciation of the exchange rate, which responds mainly to external factors with the fiscal situation that still creates structural deficits and low flexibility levels to attack that fiscal situation. So I can mention several positive things, Ken. I think Jose Antonio already mentioned one, and it's the reduction of subsidies to gasoline for the fuel prices. But we have a situation that's structural. It didn't begin with the Petro government, no, but the decisions made during his government did not arrange that structural problem. That's the heritage that we will receive. Thank you, Jose Ignacio. Carolina, let's talk about other aspects about that management that's complicated in several factors. We have what comes from overseas, like the effects of the supply chains, the result of the war in Iran, and inflation, the increase in the minimum wage in Colombia. How do you see it in an extensive way, the management that will be received by the elect president in 2 weeks from now? Ben, thank you. And before responding your answer regarding prices, let me go back to the prior question because we only looked at the fiscal aspects. And I do believe that this government will give a balance that has several positive indicators on a short-term basis. One is that we keep slowly growing in our economy towards more recovery. The employment is at levels, historical lower levels. The trust of the consumers has recovered since 2024, reaching levels we didn't see for the past 10 years. The financial sector is stronger. The poverty levels are reduced compared to what we saw before the pandemic. We also have an institutional response that's solid. We saw that institutionally the counterparts did work. So that was positive, particularly in the fiscal aspects. Besides the effort made to eliminate the subsidy of gasoline that the governments before didn't do, I'd like to highlight another element in the fiscal aspect and with the support of the government, and it's the consolidation of the autonomous committee of ceilings. This in 2022 began to operate, and thanks to the management of several people and the members of the committee, it was a fundamental voice to analyze things, the fiscal, to get to know the figures. And so SCARF now has a project of the deficit that's very different to that of the government. And now, talking about prices, it is a problem. Inflation is worrisome. We see inflation that dropped from its peak in 2023, which was more than 13%, and it dropped gradually. We reached 5% at the end of 2024, and it stopped. Inflation stopped there. Now, what we see is an uptrend of inflation. We see that the government says that this is something external, it's because of the Iran war, it's because of supply and demand, but the reality is that the war began in 2020, no, in February 28th this year, but the prices have been rising since before. So what about what's received by the government in terms of inflation? An uptrend. And part of this performance is related to climate, also because of the prices of fuel, because of the Iran war. But it had a strong inertia related to the increase of the minimum wage. But right now, what we see is a complicated situation in terms of inflation, which fortunately we have a central bank that's independent and seeks to meet the purpose of keeping good purchasing prices. Okay, Jose Antonio, could you please tell us more about inflation as well and the path of the interest rates that Carolina mentioned? Because this will have to do with the growth of the economy for the first semester or quarter of the new president. Okay, as Carolina has already said, obviously inflation stopped falling last year and it's rising this year. It's a complicated discussion because of what's happening here. But yes, there are international factors involved related to the war of Middle East. And even there's another risk that's being discussed, and it's the El Nino weather phenomenon that will hit the agriculture and will increase agricultural products. And even before that, the war in the Middle East elevated the prices of fertilizers. So there are negative supply factors, but the inflation rate has increased 1 percentage point in the response of the Central Bank of Colombia has been to increase the percentage point twice and 75 basic points, a total of 2.75 percentage points. So you can discuss or argue if this has been excessive. But anyway, it's a phenomenon that's worrisome because of how it can hit all the sectors of the economy, even homes that may have debts or especially for their financing. Curiously, and this has been widely debated by the government and the central bank, Petro has said that the external financing cost has increased as well. But as I've said, this is false. Indeed, if you take as reference December of 2023, the exchange rate of the central bank dropped. Instead, those of the bonds of public debt in Colombia called TES or TES increased those of short and long term. So the expectation of the fiscal impairment increased the interest rates of public debt while the others rates dropped. But also, curiously, I must say, there's a topic that reflects also the trust and if there are proper fiscal measures or not, is that the rates of tests are dropping now. Since Abelardo Despella won, they started to drop. And then the margins of risks, of international risks, of the Colombia bonds have dropped 0.5 percentage point, while the other rates of Latin America have not dropped. So really the rate of public debt really depends more on the trust or the expectation held over the fiscal management of the government. So it was negative and now it's positive. And we'll see it will continue to be positive because it will depend on the decisions made by the next government. Briefly, Jose Antonio, what do you anticipate from the future appointments made for by the new president of the central bank, given what we've seen in past years? Because the relationship with the bank and Petra has been hard. Okay, the appointments made by the government of two board members of the bank are made 2.5 years later after taking office. So the board members are the same, and the manager of the central bank is the same. So what really changes is a treasury minister, which is a board member. So if you wish, there is a majority now of the adjustment policies, since I'm sure that the new treasury minister is aligned with the adjustment. Thank you. There's another topic I'd like to address, and it's that of poverty. Jose Ignacio, the government says, Petro's government says, that it has almost dropped 4 million people in poverty and that it has rescued almost 2 million people from extreme poverty. And a couple of weeks ago, there's La Silla Vacía program that talked about several factors that talk about why yes and why no, if those are real figures, etc. Could you tell us something about that? And if there has been any development in the reduction of poverty in Colombia? This is an interesting question, and it's a discussion that's still underway because there are some indicators that seem to be way too good, and we wonder how we're managing to reach those developments. Firstly, sure, there was a bounce back because COVID was a complicated crisis for Colombia. Colombia has an employment market that's highly informal, and that informality was difficult to protect during the times of the pandemic because in addition to the quarantines, it was hard again to protect the people socially. And the government tried to do so, but clearly there was a big increase in poverty. When it comes to post COVID, indeed, we saw major gains in terms of poverty. And also in Petro's government, we saw gains. And I think that's one of the best news and what we can rescue past years. The factors that back this are hard to understand, however. In this government, that of Pedro, there's an intention to expand the network that protects the poor. But this, I believe that this is more related to social programs because we see more people being employed by the government. And I think that this is more relevant and more pertinent because although you can say that the increased minimum wages, remember the poverty levels do not reflect yet the 24% increase in the minimum wage, but we have a sequence of major impacts. And you can say that this is part of the responsibility, but in a country with so much informality, you can explain this that way. So I think that there are several hypotheses that fight over each other regarding the increase of helping the people that are poor. We have warned, and there is a hypothesis that explains this, and is that Colombia is more headed towards being service oriented. And this is labor intensive, yes. And obviously, it creates a more resilient employment market. And that's part of the explanation why in past months or semesters we've seen lower unemployment rates, creations of jobs that do not grow significantly because Colombia is growing between 2.5% and 3%, but not more than that. So there's an explanation, yes, but it's not the only one of why we see the reduction of poverty rates. Another important element, not only for the macro, are the remittances. We know that remittances in Colombia have been gaining importance in Colombia. There are figures that exceed $12 billion per year. And we know the remittances also are for the poorest homes. So, in addition to the social network, we have remittances, and those are the elements that we have to keep in mind in discussion that's still open. But I think it's one of the best news because we have managed without growing much. And I think that Colombia can grow much more to have improvements in the poverty levels. And this is one of the most challenging topics and most important topics of the country. Thank you, Jose Ignacio. Carolina, would you like to add something? Yes, I'd like to complement what Jose Ignacio just mentioned. The structure of the productive supply or offers in Colombia has been changing for some time. Jose Ignacio mentioned that today services is more relevant, but not only that, it's the main sector that creates the economic activities in Colombia. 10 years ago, the main sector was secondary industries, construction, mining. And it represented 8% of the GDP, while the tertiary was 16%. And for what? less than 10 years, we have been seeing a shift. And today, the productive sector is more tertiary. We have an economy that depends more on services. Services represent 21% of the GDP, while industries, construction, and mining represent only 18%. So today, the economy has changed structurally and depends on services, which has created the chance of having more jobs tied to technology, to lower prices of cell phones, AI, motorcycles, many elements that has given rise to services, but it degrades the sector that's secondary of the industry. And this normally happens in advanced economies. We see a process in which the industry becomes more sophisticated and reaches certain levels. There we start to see that services gains importance. But in Colombia, we are de-industrializing prematurely. We see services, yes, but we do not see development in manufacturing or industries. So this is a topic that I wanted to talk about, the shift of our productive sectors in favor of services, which has led to increased jobs and also of people opening their own bank accounts because of technology. Today, we see many independent workers that are not informal necessarily, but are connected remotely to other latitudes. It's called globotics because of technology, or internally, thanks to platforms, they have access to jobs that didn't exist before. Jose Antonio, let's talk about the agenda of the elected president in terms of the economy. And let's begin about the economic policies, keeping in mind that the elected president won half of the votes in the elections, and he will have a very fragmented and divided Congress. So I wonder, can he drive his legislative agenda? And does he have the personality and the experience to moderate his agenda, to establish the coalitions, permanent or not, that will be quite important to be successful? To begin, the announcements made so far are partial. Obviously, there were campaign promises, but how much that will be set forth is yet to wonder. Step-wise, what will he do exactly and when? At least the announcements so far is that there is no tax reform initially. I think that's incorrect. I think he should begin with one for the fiscal adjustment. And also, we've heard that they want to push investments and reduce taxes of companies. Colombia has a corporate tax rate that's high, 35%, one of the highest of the world, indeed. And the proposal to drop it is complicated because with the fiscal situation, you can't run the risk of a reducing public income, right? In terms of public expenses, there's nothing specific yet. Yes, there will be a massive cutback, but yesterday we heard the elected president talk about cutbacks in the presidential administration, but we're talking about only 300 jobs. That's very little. That's a small number, right? Indeed. Something I would like to add to what's been said by Carolina José Ignacio is that according to the figures we've seen so far, a very important part of jobs is public employments in Colombia. What I've seen in the data, but they're not official, of course, is that we're talking about more than 600 jobs in the public sector. There was more than 700,000. And if this is true, the reduction uh, uh, is related to public jobs, really. So there, surely the new government will have to make massive uh, have to massively fire people because, but we'll see what will happen. And, but what effective cutbacks will be made while they need other resources? For instance, in health, he announced an increase of 10 billion pesos initially in the budget for health. And there are payments pending for the energy subsidies that are important because the chance of a power rationalization because of the El Nino weather phenomenon is true. And there are announcements of how much more money the military needs. So the question is, if there is an increase of expenses when you have to cut back 50 billion pesos at least, we're talking about more than 3% of the GDP. So what's the full package? And that's something that we're still waiting for. In other fields, what's really novel right now is the announcement made to push for the fracking and for the industry of oil and gas. But that's really the only announcement on a particular productive sector made by the new government. Again, this is a fragmented agenda, and I'd say that fiscally, so far, I think it's quite confusing because you don't know what's the net effect of the different announcements made so far. Thank you. Jose, what do you anticipate with the legislative agenda of the elected president, given the complex and complexities and difficulties seen? Talking prospectively, this government will face major challenges. Perhaps the biggest ones will be in energy, because with the El Nino weather phenomenon, there will be, and big debts with the private sector, which are not explicitly seen in public debt accounts, and the subsidies as well, as Jose Antonio mentioned, of energy and gas. We have also the debts of Air E, an operator in the Northern Caribbean, which is hurting the chain, the production chain, especially in the thermal plants, because they are very important for backup energy when we start facing the drought with El Nino. So they will be important. So on a short-term basis, the government will face a complicated energy sector. Health will require also quick interventions. And this agenda, although it's known, we don't know details of the new administration. We don't even know who will be taking that health sector over. And safety and fiscal solutions will not be solved right away and will need complicated discussions as well. We particularly have been trying to provide proposals. We did so for the country and we presented them to several campaigns, not for just one. And these proposals are mostly to seek more efficiencies and expenses. It would take me way too long to talk about these measures in detail because but because of the inflexibilities, but we think that there's major space to reduce expenses, to make the government more efficient. The announcements made by the elected government seem to be taking that same path, but we don't know details yet. So Obviously, we would like to see this to be useful, but still, we don't know well. And as you mentioned, another challenge is that some of these things rely on having major reforms in Congress. Fiscally, we're not only talking about the tax reform, but also a fiscal reform where we have tax reductions, which will be challenging, more flexibility within our proposals. We think that we should finish specific destinations. And that goes through the fact that we have majorities in Congress. And it's still early to see how that relationship will go. Initially, we saw, without being an expert on this, of course, we already saw a very first round with the elected government. But when it comes to the major and most important proposals, I'm optimistic that the new government, can create a coalition that will pass major reforms. Well, of course, with consensus and elections or commitments. But I think that the new government will have space to pass the reforms. The question is, how will these major reforms take place? Because the new government will need big capital, and we'll see what it will bet on mostly. Repeating, the urgent sectors are energy, health, and two other topics that are important: fiscal and safety. Thank you, Jose Ignacio. Carolina, looking more at safety, it's not the topic of this debate, but I assume that this will have an impact on the economic policy and the interests of the elected president to drive the adjustment policy. What do you think? How could the economic and fiscal policy affect the safety or security, which I can imagine will be central in the first agenda of the government? Okay, I think when it comes to security and safety, there will be a shift. We have specific zones now where we see the Catatumba or Arauca. There are tensions between ELN and the disidencia de las FARC that have been handled because the government has let that advance. Also, we see in Cauca, or more in the south, conflicts between disidencias, Maquetalia, the Clan del Golfo. So we have critical points in Colombia that could go worse with the new position of the government. We think it's okay. That's a flag. But the topic of the frozen defreeze, and then we will see more problems. I also worry about social conflictivity. I mean, what's the role of the opposition? The opposition will be in the streets, it will mobilize, it will block roads. And what will be the position of the government? And the urban hostilities also can create barriers for growth and development. So, how will conflicts and security be handled is something fundamental, yes. But this has to do with governance, which Jose Ignacio mentioned, meaning how will the government relate to the other political forces and to solve the critical fiscal topic, which is the big problem, the worst problem of this administration that's leaving. We will need deep reforms, structural reforms, especially if the new government wants everything go through expenses more than taxes. And to reach what it wants so far, necessarily, the, it will require the majority support of Congress so that advances and the mission of fiscal sustainability will have to go through structural reforms. I agree with Jose Antonio. We need a tax reform now. What will happen in 2027, in July 29, we have to present the budget plan for this year. As we've seen, because of the new tax given by the Petro government, this means that they will give an inflation that's inflated subject to the 20 billion it has. So what does the new government receive? It receives budgets definanced that's subject to a financing law. So the new government cannot do anything without going through Congress, and the adjustments. We're talking about 10 billion pesos that will be saved from a deficit of 20 billion. I mean, there's no comparison. And he said that the 20 billion will be for social expenses. So when it comes to the scenario, it's fundamental to think about the structural reform. The minister, the new minister wants to amend the tax, the tax reforms. We cannot reduce the expenses. And they say that they want to have a tax reform that's more integral, that will simplify everything, only leaving the VAT, internal and external, no more taxes. To simplify the tax statute is welcome, of course, but we have to look at our tax system today. So I think it's very hard to end this year without a fiscal reform, to have a budget without a structural reform. So going back to safety without governance, we cannot make the structural adjustments needed. Thank you, Carolina. Given the challenges, let's talk about inequality. Jose Antonio, you launched a book recently proposing policies to advance on inequality. Going back to challenges, is there money or are there policies today that the government can adopt to advance on inequality, or will inequality just stay in the back until who knows when? Or is there another way to advance in inequality? Well, in terms of increasing the social public expenses, it's not viable to do much. You can, however, improve what you focus on. Who receives or benefits from the public expenses? And in the current government, initially the proposal, the idea was to call the suspend, which the way to identify the beneficiaries, which has been quite efficient. There are sectors that receive subsidies that shouldn't receive them. And we set the idea to create a program based on revenue or the income of people using different information systems of income to identify them, but that wasn't done. And now we're talking about doing it again. I wish it could be done because that was a great proposal made. And I was part of those ideas. So we can reorient the public expense to reach the sectors that need it the most. That can be done. Even amid the adjustment of the public expense, it's far from easy. It's complicated, and we can see how to do it. And tax-wise, obviously, I defend the reform of 2022 of a tax system that's more progressive. In 2022, several benefits were eliminated, tax benefits for people with high income, but others remained, and others, especially in the case of the VAT, that wasn't handled, especially because of the complicated issue. It took place in 2021, no, 2020 really, when the past government wanted to make a reform eliminating those types of benefits. And implicitly, this new minister says that he wants to eliminate these benefits, but I want to look at that. I think that something could be done there, but it's very complicated. But on the other hand, if you want to reduce taxes to those that have high income to increase investments, you're going the other way. I mean, with the alternatives that we have today, something can be done, but very little in terms of income distribution. Before Ben speaks, Carolina, José Ignacio, would you like to add something about this? Quickly, I'd like to say that the discussion of the inequality in Colombia is complicated. It's very structural. It's hard to have gains on a short-term basis, especially when there's a market inequality that's inherited and it's hard to correct unless we do it with programs or very clear public policies. So I think that one of the big sources of inequality in Colombia is in the educational sector. And Colombia has had major increases investing in education, but not good results. So I would talk about the efficiency of public expenses in education. In the fiscal proposals, as Jose Antonio said, focusing or focalization can be improved. We think that 10% of the people that receive subsidies in Colombia clearly do not need them. And it's well known that although the pension system in Colombia is regressive, so we're not only talking about taxes, but we also have to talk about the education and the capability of the government to reduce inequalities with the social programs. And with that combination, I think we can start to see advances in terms of inequality, which again is a very, very structural, hard topic. Carolina, any word? Yes, I'd like to add something. I completely agree with Jose Ignacio. We need to focus on how we are spending money. Pedro says that the budget of education is still increasing, but in reality, what's increasing are the salaries of the teachers and college professors. And we've mentioned this in other times. There was a law approved to increase transfers to universities. So what's the quality of the expenses? And not only in education, how can we change it? But again, it needs a structural reform. Petro's government is also leaving an agenda of reforms. It presented the tax reform that I mentioned, another law for education. It also presented a reform to health. So they're leaving, again, providing an agenda with reforms with their own vision. And when it comes to conflicts, President Petro has said that if his reforms do not pass, he will resort to social mobility. So if you don't accept what I want, I'll mobilize. But going back to inequality, I agree with what the new government says. The idea is to increase that growth. We see that the economy is only growing at 2.5. It's below its potential. and the government aspires to reach 4%. But it's fundamental to create new sources, to redistribute and to have more equality. We see today is that economic growth is of low quality. We're not only growing very little, but it's mainly driven by consumption and the government's expenses, while investments have dropped entirely. And that's a big challenge that the new government receives. An investment that was a 22% of GDP today is at 18%. It's even exceeded by public expenses. So we have displacement or cutting out that's evidenced. So we see less space for the private sector, less space for productive investments, and a public expense that's just way off. So if we have the incentives for reinvestments, if we solve the topic of infrastructure, of mining, if we have proper incentives for the oil industry, for energy, we could grow back again. And I'd like to mention this as well. Health and energy are fundamental. Here we have debts, but look, it's not the debts of subsidies. Incredibly, these have been paid by the government. It's a debt of interventions made by the government in the companies. For instance, in energy, the intervention made in ARE, now it intervenes it, now the liquids will be liquidated, and then the money will have to be paid by all of the Colombians. We're talking about 4 billion pesos in health. We don't have information, but Nueva EPS was intervened, and all Colombians will have to pay for that. So Jose Ignacio talks about these not being explicit, but they are. And correcting this has to do with the strategy of growth that the new government will have to face. Jose Antonio, with the few minutes that we have, let's talk about the commercial agenda of the new government, keeping in mind that we anticipate good ties with the US. Will this have an impact or not on accessing the US market, but also efforts to diversify the ties with trade with the US, with Canada? What do you think? There's an interesting agenda. Curiously, the US today announced higher tariffs for Colombia. So we didn't start off right. With Canada, we do have positive trade talks. And I must say that the Andean economy will be interesting. The trade with Venezuela, and the relations with Ecuador and Peru, that shows positive sides as well. So let's see what happens with trade. So far, I haven't seen any announcement made by the new government. For instance, the promotion to diversify our exports. They want to be exporting more oil, but that takes time. And on a short-term basis, it's much more important to see what's done in other fields. For instance, in the agriculture, in manufacturing, and a sector that very few people talk about, and it's exporting services. Colombia could turn into a major service exporter. But for that, we're talking about technology and all. Recently, remote telephones. But I think Colombia has been underestimated in this field. And the idea is to see what is Colombia doing technology so it can lead in science and technology. It's the new boom that we have in services that worldwide, really. I could go on and on, but I think we're short of time. Okay, 2 minutes for Jose Ignacio and Carolina to talk about trade and the markets that provide services for the new government. Quickly, I believe that we've talked about many challenges today, but we also need to talk about a very favorable time now for Colombia in terms of investments. The external context is favorable still for Colombia and for Latin America, and we have to say it with a process, although it's still just beginning with the economic recovery of Venezuela. The opportunities in trade between Colombia and Venezuela is high. Secondly, I think there are very interesting bets in which, in the agriculture sector, the government can be pushing for initiatives of the private sector. The idea is to increase this sector without having to reduce forests, for instance, and that could give gains, not only for trade per se, but it could leverage to hold better agricultural talks. Also in services, Colombia has been reinforcing in this sector. It shows a lot, for instance, in tourism. And fourth, the idea is to recover an industry of hydrocarbons and mining, which, yes, is going through a transition process on a medium long term basis, but short term, Pedro's government was quite pragmatic. So I think that there are major opportunities in Colombia in energy, in agriculture, in exporting services, including tourism. And so, although the challenges that we talked about, fiscal security, et cetera, there is a window of opportunity for Colombia. Carolina, the effects in Colombia of the economic and political changes of Venezuela. I agree with Jose Ignacio. There's a great opportunity there. Right now, the only country that has positive growth rates in Latin America is Venezuela compared to Latin America, excluding Ecuador. But Venezuela will grow 4% this year and 8% next year. There are many Colombians knocking on doors in Venezuela seeking how to contribute, to enter, expand the market, and take advantage of those opportunities. So, what we're seeing, yes, again, we're expanding that market with Venezuela to reach Venezuela again. Remember, 2007, we had many billions of dollars exported there. And I believe that we have to take advantage of that. And once we see a lot of development, there will be competition with Venezuela. While it takes place with its faster pace. And also, between the new government and that of Mr. of Trump, we have to start seeing what happens because they have good relations, both presidents, but we have a higher rate tariff now. For instance, the flower sector will be was hit hard with the 10% tariff, and now with 12 and a half, even harder. So I do believe that we have a great opportunity with this wonderful relationship between the new president and President Trump. And also, we have to look at the channel of Mexico. There are many, since Mexico is the number one supplier of the U.S., Mexico needs good labor from Colombia and Latin America. Okay, with this, I would like to end this conversation. Thank you, Carolina, Jose Ignacio, Jose Antonio, Ben, and Ken for this great discussion. I think that the last comments of Carolina and the relations with Colombia with the states and with Venezuela will be kept in mind, and we will be following those types of developments. To all of you, thank you for joining us today. We invite you to follow us in the media, social media, to look at our next events and schedules. Remember, the videos, Spanish, English, and French, will be available at ccacanada.com. Thank you again for the Stimson Center for joining us. Thank you, Ben. And thank you for joining us today. See you next time. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.